Hi, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, coming to you from Peter Schramm's library in Ashland, Ohio. In this podcast, we explore America's crisis in civic education. Too many people today don't understand the history and principles that make us Americans. So we're here to explore America's history and principles and what they mean for today, what we can learn from them, and how we can restore them to their rightful place in our hearts and minds. We think it's the most important thing we can do as Americans to keep our experiment in self-government alive. So thank you for joining us in this important conversation. You can learn more about Ashbrook and the work we're doing with students, teachers, and citizens at ashbrook.org. I want to welcome everyone to this episode of The American Idea. Today, we're going to be talking about a contemporary topic, one that is urgently, immediately upon the United States, one that we see in the news almost every day, and that has been an important issue for a long time, but now, as I say, has become urgent in a way that perhaps it wasn't before, and that is the United States' relationship with China. And to join me in that conversation today is a friend of Ashbrook, an Ashbrooker herself, Rebecca Heinrichs. Rebecca is Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and also their Director of the Keystone Defense Initiative. She specializes in national security issues at Hudson. She's also, among many of her appointments, one of a few civilians on a commission for the United States Department of Defense on our strategic posture in the world. So Rebecca is both a think tank person, but also directly and intimately connected with the United States military and our strategic thinking in the United States military. She received her MA from the United States Naval War College, where she won the Director's Award for excellence in her studies. And I'm proud to say that she received her bachelor's degree here at Ashland University from the Ashbrook Center. She was an Ashbrook Scholar and one of the very best Ashbrook Scholars we've ever had. I can say that to her now that she's graduated. And we're privileged to have her serve on the Board of Advisors of the Ashbrook Center. So she's not only a scholar and has that tradition, but is now lending her time and talent to helping to govern the Ashbrook Center as we move forward. You probably, those of you who know Rebecca also, I'm sure, have seen and heard her on national media outlets like CNN, Fox News, and Fox Business. When people want a serious, thoughtful opinion on American national security issues, they turn to Rebecca. Rebecca, thanks so much for joining us today.
That is so kind. Thank you so much, Jeff. I'm thrilled to be doing this for Ashbrook. It was my time as an Ashbrook Scholar is precious to me as I look back over my studies and how different parts of my education were formative, and my most formative ways I think about the world and about the United States happened when I was an Ashbrook Scholar. So it's a privilege to be able to do this now and to continue doing everything that I can now, not only for U.S. national security, but in particular, you gotta work on the things that make this country great and worth protecting, and that's the business of the Ashbrook program. So thank you for inviting me to do this today.
Just today, you have a piece out in National Review, and if I can start by just reading a couple of sentences from it. I'd say they're fairly provocative sentences, but I'll read them and let our listeners decide. You're right. China is outgunning the U.S., engaging in reckless operational provocations and scorning U.S. diplomatic overtures. China is preparing for war. The U.S. must urgently prepare for war with China to prevent one. That's pretty stark. When we had Secretary Mike Pompeo here, he was asked and gave his thoughts, what's the single greatest threat to the United States? And he said, according to him, there's only one threat to the United States that can actually change the way Americans live their lives. And he said, it's the Chinese Communist Party. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do. And the way that I have been thinking about it and explaining it to people is, what makes China such a huge threat? What makes any country a threat to the United States? And there's two parts. it's their desire to harm the United States. And there are all kinds of state and non-state actors that desire to harm the United States. But then it's also their ability to harm the United States. And it's the combination of those two things that make for a very toxic problem for us to deal with. And so, of course, North Korea is a problem for the United States, a serious problem, a very deadly problem with their nuclear program and their desire to kind of coerce and compel the United States in their particular region. But they don't pose anywhere the kind of threat that China poses to the United States. And that's because of the size of China's economy and how deeply we are intertwined and reliant in various ways with the Chinese, and the size, scope, and kinds of weapon systems that they have been investing in their military.
Let's talk a little bit more about that last part, because I'm curious to know your thoughts on what exactly is the threat that China poses. Is it an economic threat? Is it a diplomatic threat? Is it a military threat? A political threat? Is it all of those wrapped together? What is it exactly?
It is all of those wrapped together, unfortunately. But where countries really derive their power, their ability to make other countries do what they want them to do, is their ability to create incentives and disincentives financially, and brute force power, military power. And in those two categories, China has it in huge amounts. And so when you think about, okay, so what's the threat to the United States? You know, the United States, really since the Second World War, and then navigating through the Cold War, and really as a, living in the post-Cold War era, we've been living in a world in which the United States is the preeminent military and economic power. And that has served Americans really well. It served us well because not only because things that we benefit from, global trade, it's the United States and the West, the free world broadly speaking. I don't mean just democracies, but mostly democratic systems within that category, benefit from the peace and security of global commons, the oceans, air, the international airways. And so you have free and prosperous trade. It's not just that, though. It's the way we even think about what is fair and honest trade practices. And all of that has been the version of what we believe is right and good and fair. And because we've been the preeminent power economically and militarily. And now what has happened is China, I don't want to get too far into your next question, but China now has the ability to contest the United States in a very serious way, economically, with the massive market that they have, but also militarily. They can start. So when we say free and open, international waters, how much trade and commerce goes through Asia, China can say, well, no, we disagree. We disagree with your version of what is fair, and even what are actual boundaries, national boundaries that we recognize. And they can compel and coerce the United States that way, using their military to threaten off major access economically that could be devastating to the American family. And so it puts us in a hard spot relative to what the Chinese would want us to do or not do.
So let's talk a little bit about the way that we think about China. If what you're saying is true, that they have this enormous economic power that's been growing, and they seem to be, as you say, investing in military in a way that is designed to be able to allow them to project that force in ways that could disrupt America and other countries in the world, for example, in commerce and trade. What's the best way for us to think about China? Is it, and I know this has shifted since 1972, and thinking of Nixon's, of course, trip to China to open up American-Chinese relations. Is it as a strategic partner? Is it as a strategic rival? Or is it as an enemy?
Yeah, I tend to use the word rival or adversary. I think an adversary is definitely what I believe the Chinese public officials are pushing us into the corner to simply come to that conclusion. And it's important to be able to identify things accurately, because then you can more clearly articulate what your responses and your policies should be. Um, in some ways, they've been competitor, but competitor is kind of the phrase that the Trump administration used. You think of great power competition, we're competing with the Chinese, but especially over the last several years during the Biden administration, with combination of just the rhetoric from Chinese officials towards the United States, blaming the United States for COVID. They're still doing that. They're still blaming the U.S. Army for that, making things up whole cloth, accusing the United States of all kinds of horrible things that we haven't done. But also it's not just the direction of their military. They are now flexing those military muscles by threatening and sort of practicing invasions of Taiwan. They've been flying within tens of feet of U.S. military aircraft, of our aircraft flying in international airspace. The PLA have been, the People's Liberation Army, the military part of the Chinese government, have been acting. I mean, I would even say, provocative doesn't kind of go far enough. It's reckless. There was one Biden official I thought very colorfully, kind of, I'm going to paraphrase now, but described them as essentially like a drunk driver driving around a schoolyard. It's so reckless that they're really tempting the United States to say, enough, we're not going to tolerate this. And so they're directly challenging us militarily. I mean, of course, the Chinese spy balloon that flew across the United States, that's a military aircraft that had a payload on that we still don't have full understanding, we, the American people, sort of in the public space, about what that was. But it was directly, they don't have a hard line between what is civilian, what is non-military and military. It's they have this fusion between the two in direct service to the military. So they're a rival. They're a rival and they're an adversary. And the United States needs to, I think, get over the fact that this is just kind of the situation we're in, and then our policies then should reflect that more accurately. And that's the only way you're going to get to a position where you can kind of stabilize the situation, rather than what I think it's just getting worse over time, and headed for a really big problem.
Okay, so if you think that we used to consider them, or the Trump administration used to consider them as competitor, as you said, and now we've moved to the word adversary. Competitor, is a kind of neutral term, right? We're in competition with them, and we're each seeking a certain goal, and we're in competition with them to get that. Adversary, to me, suggests that they have a goal that is fundamentally antagonistic to our interests. Is that true? Yeah. And if it's true, what is their goal?
So, and this is where you begin to have analysts kind of disagreeing. It's much easier to empirically look at capabilities, and reasonable people can look at their capabilities and say, yes, this is what they have. But then to try to get into the mind of adversaries, it's much harder. And of course, those things can change. They're dynamic. They've got agency. So depending on what we do, they can kind of change their mind and do different things. But so I do strategy and foreign policy sort of generally, looking at the direction of power politics. Then I have to know enough about the way some of these countries think and operate to make sense of it all. But my true China experts who have spent time in China and who speak Chinese and who have read their scholarship and have really been tracking the rise of Xi Jinping, they would tell me, Matt Pottinger was the architect of the Trump foreign policy towards China on the National Security Council. And he says they are highly motivated by Marxist Leninism, that Xi Jinping himself is a Marxist Leninist. And so they view the world from that way, that they really truly believe that with Chinese characteristics. And so there is no higher good, there is no higher source of understanding of where good and right conduct come from than the Chinese Communist Party, and at the top, Xi Jinping. And so they fundamentally reject this idea of geopolitical pluralism, that national sovereignty and self-determination, of course, from an American perspective, the dignity endowed by God of the human person. These are not ideas that the Chinese Communist Party embraces. In fact, they reject them as silly and stupid. A lot of their propaganda lately that I've been tracking, because they engage with me sometimes on social media too, is they're trying to demonstrate that actually democracy has failed, that democracy is slow and bureaucratic and incompetent. Look at us fight. Look at the Americans fight and disagree about all these things, and they're immoral and depraved and terrible. And look at us. We're efficient, harmonized, make no mistakes, and that our system, and in fact, it's very racial, very racial. The Han Chinese view, their view of ethnicity of Han Chinese as the pure race too. So it's they see themselves and their system of government as superior and all in service to the Chinese Communist Party. And
so can I say then that that's interesting, because if Xi really is a Marxist, and that when the Chinese Communist Party actually turn out to be communists, is it a kind of communism? When we think back of the Cold War, we thought of communism, and particularly Soviet communism, as imperialist, attempting to overthrow democratic countries or even non-democratic countries and install Marxist regimes in order to spread Marxist ideology everywhere and eventually have a world that's dominated by Marxist Leninism. Is Chinese communism imperialist in that way, or is it centered just on making sure China is and remains itself communist?
It's a great question. The way that I think about it and the way that I've seen them behave. So let's take something that just normal listeners here would make sense of and could recall. I mean, why is it that China censors the NBA? It seems so petty sometimes. So that, you know, the NBA goes and plays in China, but they're not allowed to say anything bad about their concentration camps where they have Uyghur Muslims. They can't say anything about Taiwan being a sovereign entity and certainly not a nation state. Nobody can really say anything negative about China. And so their censorship is very heavy, even for non-Chinese nationals just doing business in China. In fact, they even want to control the message of their Chinese nationals living outside of China. So we've seen evidences of, Chinese students who are on visas here sitting in the United States. They'll post something on social media critical of Xi Jinping, and they'll get FaceTimed from a member of the Chinese Communist Party, essentially a not so veiled threat that their parents are going to be arrested if they don't take down that social media post. So I use those examples to say it is not purely sort of a just let us be Chinese communists and leave us alone. You used to think of sort of the American idea that we want the world to be safe for democracy. You don't all necessarily have to be democracies, but we want the world to be safe for democracies. Xi Jinping's idea of what he wants is he wants China to be the preeminent power, and he wants his thumbprint to go on to other nations, international organizations that are friendly to and promote the values of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's not the same kind of sort of overthrowing democracies, that sort of messy view that we're more familiar with in the past. It is a much more slower, careful, patient, but still suffocating as an American in terms of their total rejection of free speech, free exercise of religion. I mean, there's, all of those, they're very hostile, it's antithetical to the American way of life. And so that's what they're doing. They're putting their thumbprint on every nation and organization that they are party to be in service to them and their values.
So what does that look like when they're engaging, for example, in diplomacy around the world? How do the Chinese use diplomacy to project that, what you call suffocating Marxist interest?
Well, it depends on the country. So they sort of, it's like tailored to the country that they're dealing with. Um, in the United States, I mean, they've been, oh goodness, very clever at, they have these, Chinese organizations, the Confucius Institutes have been in the United States, but it's not just those. They have huge endowments with universities where they have the ability to censor what can and cannot be said. There have been days where again, Chinese students want to organize days of remembering democracy movements in Tiananmen Square, or the Tank Man, posters of Tank Man, the famous, pro-freedom depiction. And the institution that's here in our country, in the United States, will seek to put that down, to say that it was insensitive. They play on America's sort of open wound about race, and they'll say that these are sort of stoking racial animosity towards Asian students. They sort of understand that that's something that works here, and people, don't want to be accused of being racially insensitive. And so that's what they did to stifle speech here. But in other countries, it can be, much more aggressive, where they can, you think of the Belt and Road Initiative, where they're going into developing African countries, and they give them big dreams of great infrastructure that the Chinese can build, and then they make these countries so hooked, they owe them, they're in such great debt to China, they can't ever pay it back, and they basically just have to do whatever China wants. They're totally at their whims and mercy. And so they can be much more aggressive there. And then, of course, there in that instance, it's just the Chinese coming in and taking their natural resources and everything to serve the Chinese Communist Party. The country just doesn't really have any say or ability to do anything beyond what China permits them to do. So it's tailored. They're all over European ports, and so to the extent that
that's interesting. That's not something I've heard before.
So China has been trying to buy up parts of CBB because they're sly, and because the West has bought into this assumption that if you welcome China into the global trade and international community, these sort of systems, that China will simply get rich and won't do any of that sort of old, messy, weird ideological stuff. They'll be happy to be fat and rich. And of course, that's not been true. They've just sort of been quiet about the ideology. And human beings, as Ashbrook scholars know, they're motivated by much more than just money. People have long histories and ties to things that are deeply meaningful, and so that the Chinese Communist Party never reformed, never became a pro-Western government, but there is this idea, this naivety that you can still just do business like a normal country with China and work out for you. But the Chinese have bought access to these European ports. And I know that the topic of our conversation is China. I'll stick with you, but I'll just tell you just real briefly, tangentially, how it's affecting Ukraine is, as we try to get weapons in, we have to be into Ukraine, we have to be very careful, because the Chinese Communist Party are all over European ports. And so we have to avoid where they're going, because they are, the China is supporting Russia's effort in a variety of ways. And so we don't want the Chinese to see everything that we're doing. This part, you said that it's interesting, it hasn't been brought up much. It hasn't been talked about much, because part of the problem is, they're everywhere. Their tentacles are so far entrenched that it's almost like you don't want to speak too publicly about certain things unless you've got a solution for it. And so some of these problems have just not been very public yet. And there's going to be just a drip, 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 I think, in the weeks and years to come, to see just how dangerous and vulnerable we've become, how dangerous China's become, and how vulnerable we've become.
It's interesting you said that about their tailoring their strategy very, very intelligently, really, to the particular countries. And I'm thinking of, for example, even in our country, the way in which the controversial last few years, the way in which Hollywood movies, in fact, have been scrubbed of any kind of negative reference. The big controversy over the new Top Gun movie and whether or not there'd be the Taiwan defense patch on someone's jacket. But this desire, this really desire, you mentioned the NBA, not to offend China and particularly the Chinese Communist government officials. And we see that even in American popular culture, like movies.
Oh, I mean, I watched Top Gun, in the movie theater, and maybe it's because I'm in a pretty unusually sort of, a lot of veterans, and it was an older crowd, but it was just, people were just cheering and they were emotional. It was one of the most pro-American films to come out of Hollywood. And of course, you did see the Taiwan patch on Matt's jacket in the movie. I don't think that Tom Cruise deserves if the Nobel Peace Prize meant anything anymore, he deserves to have it just from that movie, because I thought, oh my goodness, maybe we really are, we're not a declining republic. We still have a lot of fight left in us, and love of country. But it's gonna take people. And by the way, that movie went over, no surprise. I mean, it was extremely popular in Japan, in countries that are really feeling the hot breath of the Chinese Communist Party on them right now. They loved that. When I visited Poland several months ago, and had dinner with some Polish folks there who said that they were thrilled with Top Gun. And the reason I find it so interesting is because it really is this, it is the United States, including private citizens, not just our government, but Hollywood directors, movie directors, NBA individual athletes. Are they really going to let a country that's hostile to the United States tell them what they can and cannot say, even if it seems like a small thing, just to have more money? I mean, that's is there enough American kind of, absolutely not, you don't tell me what to say, left in us? And it's a big I think, signal to the rest of the world that the United States is not going to just slowly go into decline. We've got a lot of still love of country and fight in us to prevail. So the Chinese will take as much as we cede, as much ground as we cede, they'll take it, and they want more. And that's why it's so critical, even on, it seems like such a small thing, or they just don't want us to have a Taiwan flag. You got to have the Taiwan flag. You have to reject their censorship. I mean, it's shameful when you see some of these owners of sports teams make a statement about China's human rights problems and then the next day retract it. You know exactly what happened in that 24 hours, and they should be humiliated. It's a shameful thing. So anyway, I was very encouraged by Top Gun, the most recent Top Gun one, and I hope that Hollywood sees that there's still a strong market and desire among the American people, a market here for that kind of film to be made.
So let me ask you, I'm getting some sense of the answer to this question already, but maybe lay it out a little more fully for our listeners. Since 1972 and America's opening to China with Nixon, what are, in your mind, some of the most important mistakes we've made in the China relationship that has allowed it to get to this point?
We just turned a blind eye to their lack of reform. I mean, if you're going to continue to enrich a country that is their system of government and the way they treat the human person inside their own country, I mean, that should have been clue after clue after clue that we were enriching our enemies. So, the welcoming them into the WTO, of course, is sort of the very famous big blunder. But that's only that's the big one that enabled them to get rich really quickly, to be able to, and it always kills me when these Chinese propagandists say, look, China's rise from poor to wealthy great nation, such in just a few decades, demonstrates that democracy failed, and that you don't have to be a democracy to be rich and successful. To which I say, China would still be a poor country if they had not utilized the systems of capitalism and free market and trade, and our view of what is fair and honest trade and business practices. They simply would not have, but they benefited from those ideas. But the problem is, as they got richer, and they didn't reform. They started getting bolder in their refusal to follow the laws, the international laws and trade practices that we believe. So now it's like these small little companies that are still doing business in China. I mean, I've got, friends I talk to out here who say it's just a major problem because China just doesn't even acknowledge their patents, their intellectual property, just the integrity of what these Americans have produced with their minds they produce. China simply doesn't give them their royalties and just takes their intellectual property, and there's not anything that we can do about it. You really get sideways if you don't have the relative strength economically and militarily, really, to put it in the crudest terms, to make these countries comply. So those were the big blunders. At some point, somebody should have hit the brakes and said, this is not working well. We are enriching. I mean, I think about when Newt Gingrich went to Taiwan when he was Speaker of the House. He could go visit Taiwan, and China could get really mad about it. There really wasn't anything they could do about it militarily. But now I still am very defensive of Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan. And now if Speaker McCarthy wants to go to Taiwan, that's the Speaker of the House's prerogative to visit Taiwan. But now China can do something about that. They've got the reach and the military heft, and it makes me really uncomfortable.
So let's talk about, that last point is really interesting to me, because it's a suggestion, I think, of some of your ideas. Then, if those are the mistakes that we've made, how do we correct them? How should we act toward China? And I mean that both in the sense of policy and in the sense of posture.
So I'm not, I'm still of the mind that sort of, you want to speak softly and carry a big stick. That's generally a good kind of posture, although sometimes it works well to also speak loudly and carry a big stick with certain countries. That works too, as we saw during the Trump administration. Sometimes that does work to good effect. I think in the case of China, though, I think that we need to stop trying to insist that there's still some reason that we can reason with them and come to some sort of mutual understanding. China is now, they've been very patient in investing in particular kinds of weapon systems to particularly threaten the United States in space, in the air, cyberspace, and on ground and at sea. Very, very intentionally, they've done that. And so I think at this point, it's going to take a lot of wisdom, but one, the United States can't continue to sort of cede ground to them. I think you have to, some of these contests that the United States is having in space, or we've seen with the spy balloon, you can't simply say, whoops, I hope you didn't mean to do that, and then kind of look the other way, or just slap a couple of sanctions on a couple of PLA officers. You really do have to very loudly, not loudly isn't the right word, but you have to come down. There has to be a very clear consequence for that action that does cause some pain to China, so that they can calculate, is that really worth it? Was that worth it to us to do that? Where we've now had some kind of sanction here, or we've been called out in this way, in this diplomatic cable, or in some way. We need to see more of that. I actually think the Biden administration has done a pretty good job over the last couple of weeks in particular. I've really noticed it pick up this week, which probably means China's being really bad. But of being more public with allies and partners, just very carefully, sort of calmly explaining what, that the Chinese balloon fleet, for instance, is not just over the United States, that they've got another. I get other countries on the same page, understand the nature of the problem and the scope of the problem needs to happen. But most fundamentally, and this gets back to the piece that we started with that you quoted, we must have a more robust military that is able to convince Xi Jinping in particular, but the Chinese Communist Party and the people around him, that we have the ability and the political will to make them regret attacking U.S. interests, vital interests in the Pacific in particular. And that's the heart of deterrence. We need to have the ability, and we need to be able to convince them that we'll use that ability to protect our vital interests. And of course, I'm talking about Taiwan, but not just Taiwan. Taiwan is very important geopolitically for several reasons. We can talk about that or not, but I mean, it'll cause a global depression if China takes Taiwan by force. So, but we have to write that. We have to write that. And so that's why I argue we really need to be on a war footing, because since the Cold War, we really gutted our industrial capability to produce lots of weapons at scale. We divested of a lot of those categories of weapons, and everyone's famous now through Ohio and the Midwest. Manufacturing has been shipped overseas. And a lot of those capabilities, even if they don't have direct military purposes, they are the things that go into military weapons. And so we need to be reinvesting with a strong sense of national purpose and urgency to get weapons immediately. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's just got to be a lot of missiles, a lot of firepower of various ranges into the Indo-Pacific region to convince the Chinese that they will not prevail if they try to really strike out at U.S. Preeminence, and that's with open waterways for trade, for them to take that from us and be the ones that are controlling that.
So those are some examples of policy. And even, I guess, to some would say posture, right? You're saying the United States needs to be in a posture of, as you say in your piece, preparing for war so that we have to go to war, and making it clear to the Chinese, we'll fight you if we have to. And your sense is the incentives work in the Chinese mind that while they're Marxist Leninists, they're not crazy. They think carefully and calculate carefully and decide whether or not it's worth it. What about another particular policy? The Trump administration, I think, did not want to go forward with this. It was proposed before them. I'm thinking of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the trading bloc that would be U.S. and the rest of the Asian countries minus China. Some people have argued that would be an important step to promote U.S. relations and reduce the economic clout of China. Have opposed it. What do you think about that particular policy?
I'm in favor of it in principle. I think, and I'm not. This is not my deep level or area of expertise, but my understanding was that the Trump administration would have liked to have something like it, but better proved upon, sort of like what they did with NAFTA. This idea of a different of a better version of it because of the problems that were inherent to it. But yeah, so if you think about it, you want policies that sort of, it's that both threaten pain, and you want policies and architectures with our alliances that just increase our leverage and our power and decrease our dependence on them. And that's why, I differ a little bit with some of the more, they don't like to be called isolationists. They don't see themselves that way, but the more populist sort of America firsters to the point where they think that our alliances are really just a headache right now, and causing us heartburn and risk drawing the United States into a larger war that we can't afford. It depends, I would say. It depends. In the case of China, the United States cannot. We need as many people in our orbits as we can at this point for trade purposes and security. The combinations of all of our military forces. It's also why I don't love the Biden administration's paradigm of democracy versus autocracy, because frankly, I'll take any country that doesn't want to be invaded by the Chinese, who wants to be on our side, whether it's the Vietnamese, whether it's the Saudis and the Emiratis. So that's kind of where I think we are right now is, so it is, you want to shore up our relative power so that we're stronger economically, so that we don't have things like critical antibiotics that are all made in China. You got that stuff produced. It doesn't need to, it would be great if it was all produced in the United States. I think it's unrealistic to get all that stuff here. I don't think China's going to sit back and watch happen. But we can sort of group it into different deals and partnerships to ship it to friendly countries, to India's and to other countries sort of regionally. This is also why I think it's important you have a stabilized Europe. We need the Europeans, not to help us sort of directly militarily versus China, but you want them to take hold of policies that are conducive to U.S. interests versus China. Everything to me is, how are our policies with these countries in view of the priority that China is the paramount problem? And so, yes, that's another powerful tool that we need to use is fostering good relationships, trade relationships that box out China and help these other countries flourish. Kind of entice them to say, look, the United States is still a better deal here. it's going to be good for you. It's going to be good for all of us over here. Just, come with us and we can do this. And I think that we should be very, very diligent and working really hard diplomatically to make that happen.
We've been talking about problems that China poses to the US. What about the problems that China has itself internally? So, for example, some people have argued what we need to do is a kind of policy of containment in the way that you're outlining, the Australians and the Indians and the Japanese and the Vietnamese and the Europeans together with us in containing China. And some people have argued if you contain China, because they have allowed some, call it capitalism, some private property, some market economics and market activity and entrepreneurship and sort of thing, although obviously carefully circumscribed and limited in a way that we wouldn't call free. But that exists, that there could be a disjunction between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party. Eventually, the regime can't sustain itself. And that our job is to contain China until Soviet style, the system just can't prop itself up anymore and it falls apart. What do you think of that argument?
It's possible. To me, it's a little bit, I think that Americans love to try to put things in formulas and then sort of like a simple, if we can do this, then this will be the outcome. I think that things and human beings are just very complicated and dynamic. And so it is certainly possible. I wouldn't bank on it. I'm generally of the mind that aiming for very big outcomes that would give us some kind of permanent peace, whether that comes through this perhaps noble, but I think doesn't work out so well, sort of make the whole planet democracy, sort of the end of history, Fukuyama style. Hoping that that's the direction we go, I think is idealistic and naive and dangerous, because you can hold on to those some sort of erroneous fundamental assumptions about human beings and nations. And but I think on the other side too, this idea that you can sort of put the squeeze on them and they'll sort of fall apart, and then you'll have freedom, democracy, or at least something better than the Chinese Communist Party come up. I mean, it's possible. I was heartened that during the zero COVID lockdowns in China, you did finally have some protests. And that's remarkable because those people are willing to die. If you're willing to protest Xi Jinping, and I don't think Americans still have a full picture of just how bad the repression is in China. I mean, during COVID, in the initial phase of COVID, there were doctors and lab directors in China that tried to sound the alarm, or at least tried to give more information about the strand of the virus, and they were disappeared. We don't know where they are. They were disappeared. They were arrested, and now we don't actually. They never came back up again. They resurfaced. And
in fact, now, right, very recently, the U.S. Department of Energy came out with a report saying now, in fact, the leak theory from the Wuhan Institute of Virology seems to be not only plausible, but perhaps, in fact, what happened.
Yeah, which to me, I thought was obviously what happened from the very beginning. And I had never understood why the sort of the wet market, eating bats any less offensive to the Chinese government than to suggest that maybe they have a leaky lab. But of course it makes a lot of sense. And there were scientists in the United States who were saying that and who were downplayed, but there were scientists inside China who sort of very interestingly, eyebrow-raisingly, there was one scientist who somehow had a kind of not a vaccine, but an antidote, a medicine for COVID already developed. And he tried to show that he had this, and then he was disappeared. Because of course, how would the Chinese government already have a medicine, a medicinal solution to a virus if it wasn't something that was being worked on in the lab?
All right, then, Rebecca, given the nature of China as an adversary to the United States, what advice would you give to American citizens?
I mean, I think the first thing would be delete TikTok, that TikTok app from your phone. I mean, that is directly a tool of surveillance from the Chinese Communist Party to pull your data. It's also highly addictive, and it's just that they're pulling data on you. that they can later use for all. We don't know all the nefarious things they could use on you, but they're tracking everything, every keystroke. But they're also inputting algorithms that are highly addictive. I mean, one official, U.S. official, called it digital fentanyl, which I think is an apt description of that. So, it can't be a coincidence whenever you see that the kinds of algorithms that the Chinese app in the United States, actually, there's a correlation between mental health problems with users in the United States, but the algorithms they use inside of China are to direct people towards efficiencies in home care and mathematics and that kind of thing. And so that would be my one big thing. And then any other kind of digital device that you have, if it has some kind of tracking device, make sure that you foreclose that and turn that off. And you can do that on your phone. I think any of these Chinese apps, just be very, very careful about your apps and where they come from. And the other thing I would just to encourage you, buy American. See if you can. I know it's hard and inflation is high and not everybody has the income to be able to do this. But to the extent that you can send a signal and you can let your members of Congress know and your officials that you do not want to be subsidizing, you don't want the cheap goods from China, that you want American-made products, I think that is incredibly important. And then support those in government who are focused on the China threat problem, and express that this is something that, yes, that Americans want to increase our sovereignty and decrease our reliance on China.
Well, let me ask you this, though. All right. These are big questions that we've been talking about. You are in the real world a civilian and policy advisor to the United States Department of Defense. Put yourself in the position of an advisor to the Biden administration. What's one immediate thing that the United States should do with respect to China? The most immediate, doable, good, important thing that can advance our interests in this adversarial relationship with the Chinese. What's one policy or posture thing you would say we should do right now?
I mean, I think absolutely, just because it comes down to military power, hard power, that you have to get that right. And so I would be advising them to very quickly, very, very quickly, because China does not want to fight the United States. They would like to overcome the United States without having to do that. But I think that they're willing if they think that they can prevail. And so I think time is not on our side. I think that we need to be rushing weapons into the Pacific, into Japan, Australia, Taiwan, very, very quickly. But I also think that's not the only thing. I think that it requires, I do think it is important to try to get, the voice of America, letting the Chinese citizens who are in China to understand. They do not know what's going on outside of China. They don't have access to information. They're extremely tolerant of the Chinese oppression. You've got 1 billion, whatever that's, 1.4 billion people in China. That's incredible that you have that many people who are mostly compliant with the world's most sophisticated techno-authoritarian state. But as the Chinese people have complied, the authoritarianism has gotten worse. And so, so you think of the younger people. I always think that, that it should be a liability for the Chinese Communist Party. It should be a liability with a country of that many people that they can reject and stop complying in some way. And so I absolutely believe that the United States should be working very hard. And again, you have to think about China as an adversary to get to this point. Because when you start talking about meddling in other people's inside their country, that's a different ball game. But when they are a true adversary who are really in a right now it's a Cold War. I believe it is a Cold War, truly, between China and the United States, that we don't want to go hot. You need to start pulling on the levers that we can to Xi Jinping's whole survival rests on him demonstrating that he is highly competent and can maintain peace and harmony inside China. And so I think that's the extent you can show that he can't, that these people have agency. I think that's a very powerful tool for the United States.
Yeah, fascinating. We're going to have to continue this conversation as events in China develop. Rebecca, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. Really interesting, illuminating arguments and thoughts for us to consider on what might just be the most important or urgent issue that the United States faces today. Rebecca Heinrichs, thank you so much for joining us today on The American Idea. Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.